You went to sleep, like every other night. Same body, same room, same world. But something didn't follow you back. There was a moment, quiet, unmarked, unnoticed, when your mind crossed a line it cannot uncross. That's why today feels different. Not dramatic, not obvious, just altered. You can set point to what changed. You can set explain it, but your reactions already know. Last night wasn't set rest. It was reorganization. And if you still listening to this right now, it means the update held, because this message isn't set for everyone. Only for those who woke up feeling slightly out of sync with the version of themselves they were yesterday. You still don't know what happened last night. But by the end of this video, you so understand why there's no going back. 1. Your mind was awake while you slept. You were not unconscious last night. You were simply not in control. Most people think sleep is a shutdown. In reality, sleep is a handover. Conscious command steps aside, and something far older, faster, and more precise takes over. The mind does not power off. It reorganizes reality from behind the curtain. Quantum physics tells us that systems don't pause. They shift states. When observation ends, processes intensify. That is exactly what happens when you fall asleep. The external observer, you steps away, and the internal system begins its deepest work. Last night, your mind entered a state where it no longer needed your permission. This is why the change feels quiet but undeniable. While you slept, your brain moved through layers of awareness designed to do what waking consciousness cannot: review identity without ego, scan emotional residue without attachment, and test belief structures without fear of consequence. Thoughts you resist during the day become neutral data at night. Pain becomes information. Memory becomes material. This is not dreaming. This is reconfiguration. Neural networks that had been firing automatically, habits, reactions, assumptions, were temporarily loosened. When that happens, the brain doesn't destroy them. It reevaluates them. Some pathways are reinforced, others are quietly downgraded, a few are marked as unnecessary. You didn't feel this happening because awareness was not required. In fact, awareness would have interfered. The free mind does its most important work when the ego is offline. This is why you woke up without a dramatic revelation, but with a subtle internal difference. The mind does not announce upgrades. It simply begins operating differently. Reactions are slower. Thoughts feel cleaner. Certain worries no longer carry the same weight. That's not coincidence. That's evidence. Quantum theory shows us that information can exist without being observed. Last night, information moved through you about who you are, what matters, and what no longer fits. It did not need your conscious approval to settle. And once information integrates at that level, it cannot be unlearned. This is why trying to go back to normal today feels slightly unnatural. Normal was a configuration. That configuration was altered. You didn't lose control last night. You temporarily stopped interfering. And in that space, without effort, without intention, your mind did what free systems always do when left alone. It corrected itself. 2. The brain rewrites reality. During stillness. Stillness is not empty. Stillness is where rewriting happens. When the body stops moving and the world goes quiet, the brain does not rest. It switches from survival mode to meaning editing mode. During the day, your mind reacts. At night, it interprets, and interpretation is what shapes reality. Quantum physics shows that systems behave differently when external interference drops. Noise collapses possibilities. Silence expands them. Your brain follows the same rule. Last night, when stimulation disappeared, no conversations, no decisions, no threats, the mind finally had access to its deeper operating layer. This is the layer responsible for assigning significance to experience. not facts. Significance. Events from your past that once felt heavy were quietly re-examined. Not emotionally, structurally. The brain asked a simple question: does this still matter for who you are becoming? Some memories kept their charge. Others lost it. This is why certain things that bothered you before now feel strangely distant. The event didn't change. The meaning did. And meaning is what your nervous system responds to. Free minds are not controlled by events. They are controlled by the interpretation of events. During deep stillness, the brain updates those interpretations without asking for consensus from your conscious thoughts. That's why you didn't feel an argument in your head. There was no debate, only adjustment. Neuroscience and quantum theory meet here. Both show that reality is not fixed by what happens, but by how information is processed. Last night, information was processed differently because the mind was no longer defending an identity. When identity relaxes, truth reorganizes. That's why today feels subtly altered. Not exciting, not scary, just recalibrated. Your reactions may feel slower, your judgments less sharp, your urgency reduced. This is not loss of motivation. This is precision replacing noise. The brain doesn't rewrite reality all at once. It starts by changing what feels important. Once importance shifts, behavior follows naturally. That shift began in stillness. You didn't choose it. You didn't force it. You didn't even notice it happening. But your reality is already responding to the rewrite. And once meaning changes, the world you experience can never be exactly the same again. 3. You processed a truth you avoided while awake. The mind avoids nothing permanently. It only postpones. During the day, avoidance feels like control. You stay busy, distracted, productive. You tell yourself you'll deal with certain thoughts later, after things calm down, after you feel ready, after the timing feels right. But the mind does not wait for comfort. Last night, the conditions were perfect. No performance, no explanations, no audience. The defenses that protect your waking identity softened, and something you've been circling around was finally allowed into processing. Not dramatically, quietly. This truth wasn't new. That's the important part. You've brushed past it before in moments of honesty, brief flashes you quickly redirected. A realization about a relationship, a pattern you keep repeating, a direction you've outgrown, a version of yourself that no longer fits. While awake, acknowledging it felt risky. It threatened stability. It asked for change. So you delayed it. At night, delay expires. When conscious resistance drops, the mind doesn't ask whether you're ready. It asks whether the information is accurate. If it is, integration begins. No argument, no emotional spiral, just acceptance at a deeper level. This is why the shift doesn't feel like panic. It feels like inevitability. Quantum systems don't struggle when a state collapses. They transition. What feels like fear to the ego feels like efficiency to the system. That truth you avoided wasn't processed as a problem. It was processed as data. Once processed as data, it lost its emotional charge. That's why today you may feel calmer about something you used to overthink, or strangely uninterested in continuing a pattern you once defended. You didn't decide anything. The decision happened below language. This is how free minds evolve. Not through motivation, not through force, through clarity that removes the need for debate. You might notice a subtle internal line has been crossed, not in a way you can explain, but in a way you can't reverse. Something that once felt optional now feels settled. Something that once felt necessary now feels unnecessary. That accepts not loss. That accepts alignment. Last night, your mind stopped protecting you from a truth you were already strong enough to carry. And once a truth is carried without resistance, it stops being heavy. It becomes direction. 4. Identity is not fixed. The quantum collapse. Identity feels solid only because it repeats. Most people mistake consistency for permanence. They assume that because they've been a certain way for years, they are that way. But quantum physics dismantles this illusion completely. At the fundamental level, nothing holds a single form until it is repeatedly observed. You are no different. Identity is not a core object. It is a pattern of reinforcement. Thoughts repeated, behaviors rehearsed, reactions rewarded. Over time, the pattern feels like a self. Last night, that pattern loosened. Not because something external attacked it, but because observation weakened. The moment you stopped watching yourself, judging yourself, defending yourself, the system gained freedom to reorganize. In quantum terms, the old state lost coherence. When coherence drops, collapse follows. This does not mean destruction. It means reselection. Out of multiple possible versions of you, some outdated, some emerging, the system favored the one that required the least resistance, the version most aligned with present reality, not past survival. This is why the change feels calm instead of chaotic. The mind did not erase who you were. It downgraded what no longer needed to dominate. Certain fears lost authority. Certain habits lost urgency. Certain identities lost their claim to "this is just who I am." You didn't feel a breakdown because there wasn't one. You felt a release. Quantum collapse is misunderstood as sudden or violent. In reality, it is precise. It happens when a system no longer has enough energy to maintain an unstable state. Last night, your mind simply stopped feeding an identity that required constant effort to uphold. That's why today feels lighter in unexpected ways. Not happier, not euphoric, just less strained. Free minds don't cling to identity. They allow identity to update. This is also why trying to perform your old role today may feel unnatural. You can still do it, but something in you resists fully stepping back into it. That resistance is not rebellion. It is accuracy. The system knows what no longer fits. You didn't lose yourself last night. You lost the version of yourself that needed constant reinforcement to survive. And once an identity collapses at that level, it doesn't return, not because it's forbidden, but because it's no longer necessary. What remains is quieter, more adaptable, more free. 5. The observer shifted. So the outcome changed. Nothing changes until the observer changes. In quantum physics, the observer is not a passive witness. Observation alters behavior. Systems respond differently depending on how they are being observed. This principle doesn't stop at particles. It applies to perception, memory, and identity. Last night, your internal observer shifted. The observer is the part of you that watches your thoughts, labels your experiences, and decides what something means. Most people think their thoughts create reality. In truth, it is the observer behind those thoughts that determines which thoughts matter. While awake, your observer is busy defending identity. It filters experience through expectation, fear, and habit. At night, that observer loosens its grip. It stops narrating. It stops judging. And when narration fades, the system becomes free to update. That's when the shift occurred. You didn't change your circumstances. You changed the position from which you experience them. This is why the world looks the same but feels slightly altered. The same people speak, the same routines exist, but their impact on you is reduced. Emotional hooks that once pulled you in now feel dull. Situations that once demanded reaction now invite observation. This is not detachment. This is repositioning. When the observer changes, outcomes change automatically. Not because you force new behavior, but because the system no longer interprets events the same way. The mind stops reacting on autopilot and starts responding with distance. Free minds don't escape reality. They stop being absorbed by it. Last night, your observer stopped identifying so tightly with every thought that separation created space. In that space, awareness gained leverage over impulse. This is why you may feel harder to provoke today, why certain conversations don't hook you, why explaining yourself feels unnecessary. The observer is no longer fused with the experience. Quantum systems behave this way too. When observation changes, probability rearranges. The same inputs no longer produce the same outputs. You didn't become indifferent. You became unentangled. And once the observer steps back, clarity steps forward. That is the quiet power of a free mind. 6. Why you can fully explain what changed. Language belongs to the conscious mind. Change began below language. This is why every attempt to explain what shifted feels incomplete. You sense it clearly. Yet the moment you try to describe it, words fall short. Not because you're confused, but because the change did not occur where language operates. The conscious mind speaks in sentences. The deeper mind speaks in states. Last night, the adjustment happened at the level of state, a reorganization of tone, posture, and internal orientation. These are not things the mind narrates. They are things the body recognizes before thought catches up. Quantum physics tells us that not all information is observable directly. Some information exists as potential, influence, or probability felt through effect rather than description. The same applies here. You don't know what changed in words, but you can feel how it's affecting decisions, reactions, and attention. That's evidence of integration. Free minds don't require explanation to function. They rely on alignment. When alignment shifts, behavior follows naturally without a story. This is also why overthinking what happened feels uncomfortable. The conscious mind wants ownership. It wants to label the shift, analyze it, and turn it into an identity. But doing so would interfere with the integration process. Some changes need silence to stabilize. You may notice yourself pausing more before speaking, thinking less, but with more precision, choosing differently without needing justification. These are not conscious strategies. They are byproducts of a system that has already adjusted its internal reference point. Trying to explain it too early can pull the system back into narration mode. This is why clarity often arrives before understanding. The body and nervous system move first. Language comes later, if it comes at all. Not every truth needs a sentence. The free mind trusts what is already functioning. It doesn't rush to name the shift. It watches how life responds instead. And life is already responding. 7. Discomfort is the signal that integration has begun. Discomfort after a shift is not a warning. It is confirmation. Most people misunderstand discomfort because they associate it with danger or failure. But in reality, discomfort appears when a system is between configurations, no longer operating under the old structure, not yet fully stabilized in the new one. Last night initiated that transition. What you're feeling now isn't confusion, it's integration. When the mind updates at a deep level, it doesn't immediately feel better. It feels unfamiliar. Familiarity is comforting, even when it's limiting. The nervous system has spent years calibrating itself to a specific internal environment, certain stresses, certain narratives, certain emotional baselines. When those baselines shift, the body notices first. This is why the discomfort feels subtle but persistent. You might feel slightly restless without knowing why, calm but not relaxed, alert but not anxious, detached but not disconnected. This in-between state is not emptiness, it is repatterning. Quantum systems behave the same way. After a state transition, there is a stabilization phase where energy redistributes. During this phase, the system may appear unstable from the outside, but internally it is finding balance at a new level. Your mind is doing exactly that. The old configuration no longer fits, but traces of it still exist. Habits haven't disappeared yet. Thought loops still attempt to activate. Emotional reflexes still test their authority. But something important has changed. They no longer feel justified. That's where discomfort comes from. Discomfort is the signal that the mind is refusing to fully re-enter an outdated pattern. It's the friction between what used to work and what no longer aligns. And that friction is temporary. Free minds don't panic during integration. They recognize it. The mistake most people make at this stage is trying to resolve the discomfort too quickly. They seek distraction, stimulation, reassurance, or explanation. But premature soothing interrupts stabilization. It teaches the system that the old pattern is still needed. Silence, patience, and observation allow integration to complete. You don't need to do anything right now. You need to not interfere. This phase is when the mind rewires its relationship with effort. Actions that once required force begin to feel optional. Thoughts that once demanded engagement begin to lose urgency. The system is learning that it can operate with less internal resistance. That learning takes time. You may notice moments where you almost react the old way and then don't, or moments where you expect a familiar emotional surge that never arrives. These gaps are not absence. They are space forming where compulsion used to live. That space can feel uncomfortable at first. People often mistake it for emptiness or boredom. In truth, it is capacity. Capacity for choice instead of reflex, for response instead of reaction, for clarity instead of noise. Integration is not dramatic. It is quiet, repetitive, and invisible to others, but it is irreversible. Once the system learns it can function without the old tension, it does not willingly return to it. So if today feels strange, heavy, or slightly off, good. That means the shift is holding. Discomfort is not the problem. Discomfort is the evidence. You are not lost between versions of yourself. You are settling into the one that requires the least resistance to exist. And when integration completes, what remains won't feel extraordinary. It will feel natural, effortless, free. 8. You fear losing interest in validation, and that sips the break point. One of the clearest signs of a free mind is not confidence. It sits indifference to validation. Last night weakened something. Most people never question the need to be confirmed by others, not consciously. Structurally, the internal mechanism that waits for approval, agreement, or recognition lost power. That's why certain interactions today may feel hollow. You might notice yourself speaking less, explaining less, justifying less. Not because you feel superior, but because the impulse is gone. The internal audience you were performing for has quietly left the room. This is not withdrawal. This is decoupling. Validation is a survival strategy. It forms early, when belonging equals safety. Over time, it becomes an invisible contract. If they see me, I exist. If they approve, I'm safe. Most people never break this contract. They decorate it with ambition, productivity, or confidence. But the dependency remains. Free minds break it at the root. Quantum systems behave independently once coherence stabilizes internally. They no longer require constant external measurement to maintain state. Last night, your system crossed closer to that threshold. This is why praise may feel flatter, criticism weaker, silence less threatening. The reward circuitry that once lit up when others responded favorably has been downregulated, not eliminated, just dethroned. It no longer decides your internal weather. And that creates a strange sensation. When validation fades, there's often a brief sense of emptiness. A pause where the mind wonders, if I'm not doing this to be seen, then why am I doing it at all? That question can feel unsettling, but it sits also the gateway. Because once validation stops driving behavior, alignment takes over. You begin choosing based on accuracy rather than acceptance, based on truth rather than applause, based on internal coherence rather than external reaction. This shift is subtle, but it changes everything. You may find yourself less motivated to argue your point, less interested in being right, less inclined to correct others, not because you've given up, but because you no longer need agreement to feel stable. Free minds don't need to be mirrored. They need to be clear. This also explains why certain people may feel distant today. Conversations that once felt engaging now feel repetitive. Social dynamics built on validation exchange lose their pull. The mind recognizes them as noise. That doesn't mean you'll isolate. It means your tolerance for misalignment has dropped. There's a reason this shift often happens quietly at night. Validation dependency is tied to identity. Identity resists change. Sleep bypasses resistance. Once the system experiences self-stability without external confirmation, it doesn't forget that possibility. That's why trying to chase validation again will feel strangely empty. The reward isn't there anymore. The feedback loop has been interrupted. This is the breakpoint most people turn back from. They reattach to validation because freedom feels unfamiliar, because self-directed existence feels exposed, because without an audience, the question, "Who am I?" becomes unavoidable. But free minds don't answer that question with labels. They answer it with presence. You don't need to announce this shift. You don't need to explain it. In fact, trying to explain it will likely feel wrong. Validation-seeking behavior doesn't survive explanation. It thrives on reaction. Let it fade. What replaces it isn't set, isolation, or arrogance. What replaces it is internal authority. And once authority moves inside, no external approval can compete with it. That sets why this lesson feels heavy, and why it's one of the most irreversible shifts of all. You are not becoming invisible. You are becoming ungoverned. 9. Time feels different because your reference point changed. Time did not change. You did. What you're experiencing isn't distortion, it's recalibration. Time has always been elastic, but most people never feel it because their perception is locked to urgency, habit, and repetition. When those loosen, time reveals its true nature, subjective, responsive, and deeply tied to awareness. Last night altered your internal reference point. In quantum physics, time is not a fixed river flowing forward. It behaves more like a relationship between events. Change the observer's position, and the spacing between moments shifts. That's exactly what's happening now. You may notice the days stretching or compressing. Moments that once passed unnoticed now feel heavier, more textured. Silence feels longer. Waiting feels different. Even simple actions seem to carry more weight. This isn't set slowness. It sets presence. When the mind stops racing toward outcomes, it stops slicing time into fragments. Instead of rushing to the next moment, awareness begins to occupy the current one more fully. That occupation makes time feel thicker, more substantial. Most people experience time as pressure. Free minds experience it as space. This is why productivity might feel strange today. You may still act, but without the familiar push. Deadlines don't grip the same way. The future doesn't pull as hard. The system is no longer anchored to anticipation. That can feel unsettling. Anticipation has been your compass for years. Remove it, and orientation must come from somewhere else. From accuracy instead of urgency. From intention instead of anxiety. This is a profound shift. Neuroscience supports this. When the brain reduces threat-based processing, the sense of time expands. Stress compresses time. Safety stretches it. Last night reduced internal threat signals. As a result, your perception widened. That widening is not permanent chaos. It's adjustment. Free minds don't live inside clocks. They use them. The difference is subtle but decisive. Clocks measure repetition. Awareness measures experience. Used to moving from one to the other. This is also why certain memories may feel closer or farther than before. Time is not stored chronologically. It's stored emotionally. When emotional charge dissolves, memories lose their gravitational pull. They drift. You are not forgetting your past. You are releasing its hold on your present. The danger at this stage is misinterpretation. Many mistake this shift for loss of motivation or detachment. In reality, it's the collapse of artificial urgency. You're no longer driven by imagined futures or unresolved pasts. You're orienting from now. This doesn't make you slower. It makes you precise. Actions chosen from presence are fewer but cleaner. Words spoken from presence are fewer but truer. Decisions made from presence don't require justification because they aren't reactions. This is why time feels different. Because you're no longer using it to escape yourself. You're inhabiting it. And once awareness learns how to occupy time rather than chase it, there is no going back to living in fragments. You haven't lost momentum. You have changed engines. Time didn't stretch or shrink last night. It simply stopped being your master. And that is one of the quietest forms of freedom there is. 10. You can go back. Because the system already updated. There is a point of no return in every real change. Not because going back is forbidden, but because it no longer makes sense. Last night, your system crossed that point. Most people believe change is a choice. In reality, change is a threshold. Once enough internal conditions align, the system updates automatically. After that, the previous version isn't wrong, it's simply obsolete. This is why trying to go back today feels unnatural. You can still perform the old behaviors. You can still think the old thoughts. You can still replay the old narratives. But something feels off, like wearing clothes that technically fit, but no longer belong to you. That feeling is not imagination. It's incompatibility. In physics, once a system transitions to a lower energy, more efficient state, returning to the previous state requires additional force. The system resists reversal not out of will, but out of efficiency. It has learned a better way to exist. Your mind works the same way. Last night, it found a configuration that required less internal friction, less justification, less defense, less effort to maintain coherence. That discovery changed the cost-benefit structure of your old patterns. Now, the old ways feel expensive. Overthinking costs more energy. Reacting feels heavier. Performing feels unnecessary. Not because you're tired, but because your system knows there's a cleaner option. This is why forcing yourself to be how you were feels draining. The system recognizes the attempt as regression, not comfort. It signals resistance, not relief. Free minds don't resist change. They resist inefficiency. This is also why nostalgia may briefly surface. When identity updates, the mind sometimes revisits the familiar, not to return, but to close loops. Memories appear. Old emotions knock lightly. Familiar impulses test the door. This isn't set relapse. It sets verification. The system is checking. Is this still needed? And each time the answer comes back weaker than before. This phase can feel disorienting because the future hasn't fully formed yet, but the past has lost authority. You're not anchored forward or backward. You're suspended in accuracy. Many people panic here. They rush to recreate urgency, identity, or purpose. They reattach to old goals, old dramas, old definitions, anything to feel oriented again. But orientation built on outdated structures doesn't last. Free minds tolerate the in-between. They understand that stability after an update comes from letting the system finish recalibrating, not from forcing meaning too early. The urge to rush clarity is the last reflex of the old identity. You don't need to rush. The system already knows where it's going. It just hasn't translated that knowing into language yet. This is the moment when restraint matters more than action, when observation matters more than decision, when allowing matters more than effort. Because once the update completes, your next steps won't feel dramatic. They shall feel obvious. Trying to go back won't fail because you're incapable. It will fail because there's nothing there to return to. The version of you that made the old patterns necessary has already stepped aside. Not with force, not with noise, with quiet finality. And once a system learns it can function without its former limitations, it doesn't ask permission to move forward. It simply does. 11. Others will feel out of sync with you, and that sips the hidden cost of freedom. Not everyone drifts away loudly. Most drift away silently. After a deep internal update, the first external signal is rarely success or clarity. It's misalignment. Conversations feel thinner. Familiar dynamics feel rehearsed. Certain people suddenly seem louder, faster, or more draining than before. This is not arrogance. This is not judgment. This is resonance changing. Human connection is less about shared values than shared internal pace. When two systems operate at similar levels of urgency, fear, ambition, or identity attachment, they synchronize naturally. When one system updates and the other doesn't, synchronization weakens. Last night, your internal tempo shifted. That's why today you may feel slightly ahead of some people, not intellectually, but internally. You're no longer responding from the same emotional reflexes. You pause where you used to react. You listen where you used to defend. You disengage where you used to explain. From the outside, this can look like distance. From the inside, it feels like relief. This is the hidden cost of a free mind. Fewer automatic connections. The system stops bonding over shared anxiety, shared complaint, shared urgency. It seeks coherence instead of chemistry. And coherence is rarer. People who were once central to your daily emotional life may now feel oddly peripheral. Not because they changed, but because the role they played is no longer required. Validation partners, conflict mirrors, distraction companions, these roles dissolve when the system no longer needs reinforcement. This is why interactions may feel one-sided. You're present, but not invested. You care, but you're not pulled. You listen, but you're not absorbed. That gap is new, and new gaps are uncomfortable. The instinct at this stage is to close the gap, to re-engage, over-explain, or reattach emotionally to prove nothing has changed. But forcing synchronization after an internal shift creates friction. The system resists it. Free minds don't force alignment. They allow it to reveal itself. This is also when projection appears. Some people may sense the shift without understanding it. They may describe you as distant, different, cold, or distracted. What they're really responding to is the absence of familiar emotional feedback. You are no longer feeding the old loop that can feel threatening to systems that rely on it. This doesn't mean you've outgrown everyone. It means your criteria for closeness has changed. Instead of intensity, you're drawn to stability. Instead of stimulation, you're drawn to depth. Instead of approval, you're drawn to clarity. These preferences don't announce themselves. They quietly redirect your attention. Loneliness may briefly surface here, not because you're alone, but because the old noise is gone. Silence exposes space. Space can feel empty before it feels peaceful. Most people fill that space immediately. They chase new connections, louder experiences, stronger stimulation. Free minds wait. They understand that new alignment doesn't rush. It arrives when the internal frequency stabilizes. This is the phase where discernment replaces attachment. You may notice you're less willing to stay in conversations that go nowhere, less tolerant of emotional chaos disguised as connection, less interested in maintaining proximity for history's sake. This isn't set rejection, it's SEP's precision. Every system has a carrying capacity. When internal clutter clears, that capacity becomes selective. Not everyone fits anymore, and that's not a failure, that's function. The mistake here is self-blame. Thinking something is wrong because certain bonds feel weaker. In truth, what's happening is inevitable after deep internal change. Alignment always reshuffles relationships. Some will fall away gently, some will pause, some will surprise you by meeting you at the new level. But forcing the outcome only delays clarity. You're not meant to shrink back into familiar dynamics to preserve comfort. You're meant to let relationships reorganize naturally around who you are now, not who you were trained to be. Freedom is quiet, but it's not neutral. It costs familiarity. It costs friction-based bonding. It costs being easily understood. What it gives back is integrity, and integrity doesn't beg to be matched. It waits. 12. This was a quiet activation, not a peak, and that SEP's why it will last. Most people are taught to look for peaks, moments of intensity, surges of emotion, sudden certainty, breakthroughs that announce themselves loudly and then fade just as fast. Society celebrates these moments because they seem visible, dramatic, and easy to label as change. But the most permanent transformations don't look like peaks. They look like settling. What happened last night was not a climax. It was an activation, the kind that doesn't spike your emotions or flood you with motivation, but instead reorders the foundation quietly and irreversibly. This is why you didn't wake up feeling euphoric. This is why there was no rush, no urgency, no sense of I must do something now. Peaks burn out, foundations hold. Quantum systems don't always change through explosions. Often they shift through phase transitions, subtle rearrangements where the structure stays intact, but the internal relationships change. The system looks the same from the outside, but its behavior is fundamentally different. That's what occurred. Your mind didn't gain something new. It stopped leaking energy. Energy that used to be spent maintaining stories, defending identities, anticipating outcomes, and regulating internal noise was quietly reclaimed. When that happens, the system doesn't feel excited. It feels stable. Stability is unfamiliar to a mind raised on urgency. That's why some part of you may be waiting for the next thing to happen, to confirm the shift, to validate it, to turn it into an event. But there is no next thing. The system has already moved into its new operating range. This is where many people misinterpret what's happening. They assume that because there's no emotional high, nothing important occurred. They confuse calm with stagnation. But calm after deep internal change is not emptiness. It's efficiency. You're no longer oscillating between extremes. You're no longer fueled by pressure. You're no longer driven by internal conflict. Instead, the system is learning how to function without constant self-interruption. This kind of activation doesn't demand expression. It doesn't ask to be shared, announced, or acted upon immediately. It simply changes what feels natural. That's why your impulses feel different now. Why certain goals no longer excite you. Why some ambitions feel oddly hollow while others feel quietly inevitable. The mind has updated its criteria for relevance. And because this update didn't happen through force or emotional overload, it doesn't require maintenance. You don't need to stay motivated to keep it alive. You don't need reminders. You don't need rituals to preserve it. The system already knows. This is the difference between transformation and performance. Performance requires energy input to continue. Transformation reduces energy loss by default. That sips why this shift feels sustainable. In the coming days, you may notice small, unremarkable changes. You choose silence without effort. You walk away from things without resentment. You move toward what tests accurate without drama. These aren't habits you're building. They're consequences of a system that no longer needs to convince itself. This is also why nothing feels urgent. Urgency belongs to systems that feel incomplete. Completion doesn't rush. You steer not finished, but you fear aligned. And alignment doesn't shout. It whispers through consistency, through ease, through decisions that feel obvious rather than forced. Last night didn't mark the peak of something. It marked the moment your mind stopped chasing peaks altogether. From here on, growth won't feel like ascent. It will feel like traction. Quiet, reliable, unmistakable. And once a system discovers how to move forward without friction, it never willingly returns to chaos, no matter how familiar chaos once felt. You didn't wake up changed in a way others can see. You woke up changed in a way you won't need to explain. That SIP's how you know it. SIP's real. You don't need to understand what happened last night. Understanding comes later. What matters is that your system already adjusted. That SIP's why forcing answers now feels wrong. That SIP's why going back feels impossible. That SIP's why silence suddenly feels honest. Nothing outside you changed, but nothing inside you is the same. This isn't set a moment you revisit. It subs a direction you move in. So don't explain it. Don't rush it. Don't look for permission to trust it. Just notice how your choices are quieter, how your reactions are slower, how your attention is sharper. That SIP's the free mind at work. Last night didn't make you special. It made you precise. And precision doesn't announce itself. It moves forward, without noise, without doubt, and without returning. You still don't know what happened last night, but now you know why you don't need to.